I was a police officer for over a decade before the incident occurred. I've seen my fair share of disturbing things, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. It was a chilly October evening, and I was on my way home after a long day at work. Just as I was about to turn into my street, I received a call from dispatch. They informed me that there had been a murder in a nearby neighborhood, and they needed me to respond to the scene immediately. I turned my car around and headed towards the location. As I drove, my mind was racing with questions. Who was the victim? Was the killer still at large? I tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on the task at hand. When I arrived at the scene, I was met by a group of detectives and officers. The house was a 2-story brick home, and from the outside, it looked like any other house in the neighborhood. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick and heavy, and there was a sense of unease that permeated the entire house. The detectives were already on the scene, taking photographs and collecting evidence. I could hear them whispering to each other, discussing the details of the murder. The victim was a woman in her late 30s, and she had been stabbed multiple times. Her body was lying in a pool of blood on the living room floor. I had seen gruesome scenes like this before, but this one was different. There was a sense of dread that hung in the air, as if something was watching us from the shadows. As I looked around the room, my eyes fell upon a photograph on the mantel. It was a picture of the victim and a man who looked familiar. It was then that I realized who the man was. He was a suspect in a previous murder case that I had worked on. My heart began to race as I realized that this case was not going to be like any other. This was personal, and I knew that I had to solve it before it was too late. But as I left the house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't know it yet, but the ghost of the victim was going to make sure that I never forgot what happened in that house. The investigation began the next day, and I was assigned to work on the case with a team of detectives. We spent hours going through the evidence and interviewing potential witnesses. The more we learned about the victim, the more disturbing the case became. Her name was Laura, and she was a single mother of 2 young children. She worked as a nurse at a local hospital and was well liked by her coworkers. But as we delved deeper into her personal life, we discovered that she had a dark side. Laura had a history of drug abuse and was known to associate with some unsavory characters. We learned that she had been involved with the man in the photograph on the mantel, a notorious drug dealer named Tony. He had been a suspect in a previous murder case, but we had never been able to pin anything on him. As we dug deeper into Tony's background, we learned that he had a violent past and had been involved in several other murders in the area. We were certain that he was our prime suspect, but we needed concrete evidence to tie him to the crime. Days turned into weeks, and we worked tirelessly on the case. We combed through every piece of evidence, interviewed every witness, and followed every lead. But despite our best efforts, we couldn't find anything that would conclusively link Tony to the murder. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel like we were running out of time. I felt that we were missing something, that there was some piece of evidence that we had overlooked, but no matter how hard we looked, we couldn't find it. It was during this time that strange things began to happen. I would hear strange noises in my house. Doors would slam shut on their own, and I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I dismissed it as stress and fatigue from the case, but as the occurrences became more frequent, I began to suspect that something else was going on, something that I couldn't explain. Little did I know that the ghost of Laura was watching me and she had something to say. One night, as I was working late in my office, I heard a faint whisper behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I shrugged it off and continued working. But then, I heard it again, only this time it was louder. It sounded like someone was trying to speak to me, but their voice was barely audible. I stood up and looked around the room, but I still couldn't see anyone. That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized that I was not alone in the room. Suddenly, I saw her. The ghostly apparition of Laura was standing in front of me, her eyes staring straight into mine. She looked just like she did in the crime scene photos, only now she was translucent and had an eerie glow around her. I was frozen with fear as she spoke to me. She told me that Tony was not the killer and that I needed to look in a different direction. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was I really having a conversation with a ghost? Laura continued to speak, giving me details about her murder that only the killer could have known. I listened intently, trying to absorb everything she was telling me. I knew that this was my chance to solve the case, but I also knew that I was dealing with something beyond my comprehension. As suddenly as she had appeared, Laura vanished into thin air. I sat there in my office trying to process what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? Or had I just had a supernatural encounter? Despite my initial disbelief, I couldn't ignore what Laura had told me. I began to investigate a new lead, one that had previously been overlooked, and to my surprise, I found the evidence I'd been searching for. Tony was innocent, and we had been looking in the wrong direction all along. I couldn't explain how Laura had known the details of her murder, or how she had appeared to me that night. But I knew one thing for certain. Without her intervention, the real killer would have gone free. With the new evidence in hand, we were able to identify the true killer. It turned out to be Laura's ex-boyfriend, a man named David who had a history of violence and drug abuse. He had been jealous of her relationship with Tony and had killed her in a fit of rage. We were finally able to bring David to justice, and he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case was closed, and we were hailed as heroes for solving such a difficult case. But for me, the case was far from over. I couldn't stop thinking about my encounter with Laura's ghost. Was it real? Or was it just my imagination? I tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Days turned into weeks, and I continued to feel the presence of something unseen. Doors would open and close on their own, and I would hear strange noises in the middle of the night. I knew that something was still with me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. That's when I decided to seek out the help of a paranormal investigator. I had never believed in ghosts before, but my encounter with Laura had changed my perspective. I needed to know what was happening to me, and I hoped that the investigator could provide some answers. I made the appointment and met with the investigator, a woman named Rachel. She listened intently as I recounted my experience with Laura's ghost, and she asked me a series of questions about the incident. When I finished, she sat back and told me that she believed me. Rachel explained that ghosts were often tied to the location where they died, and that Laura's spirit was likely still in the house where she was killed. She suggested that we conduct an investigation of the house to see if we could make contact with Laura again. I was hesitant, but I knew that I needed to confront whatever was haunting me. So we made arrangements to investigate the house where Laura had been murdered, hoping to make contact with her ghost once again. Rachel and I arrived at the house late one night, armed with all the equipment we needed to conduct a thorough investigation. We had cameras, audio recorders, and other tools that we hoped would help us make contact with Laura's ghost. As we entered the house, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. The air was thick and heavy, and I could feel something watching us from the shadows. We started the investigation in the room where Laura had been killed. We set up the cameras and audio recorders, and Rachel began to ask questions, hoping to elicit a response from Laura's ghost. At first, there was nothing but silence. But then, we heard a faint whisper on the audio recorder. It was Laura's voice telling us that she was still there. We were both stunned. It was clear that Laura's ghost was still present in the house, and that she wanted to communicate with us. Rachel asked more questions, and Laura's responses became clearer and more pronounced. Laura told us that she was trapped in the house, unable to move on to the afterlife. She said that she needed our help to find peace, and that we were the only ones who could free her. Rachel and I continued to communicate with Laura's ghost, trying to understand what we needed to do to help her. It was a surreal experience, talking to a ghost like she was still alive. Finally, Laura gave us the answer we had been looking for. She said that she needed us to find her body and give her a proper burial. Only then would her spirit be able to move on. We thanked Laura for her help and ended the investigation for the night. Rachel and I knew that we had to act fast if we were going to find Laura's body and lay her to rest, but we had no idea where to start looking. After our investigation, Rachel and I knew that we needed to find Laura's body in order to give her a proper burial and help her spirit move on, but we had no idea where to start looking. We began by reviewing the case files and looking for any clues that may have been overlooked. We combed through witness statements, police reports, and other documents, hoping to find a lead that would point us in the right direction. Days turned into weeks, and we seemed no closer to finding Laura's body. I was starting to lose hope, but Rachel remained steadfast in her determination to help Laura. Then, one day, Rachel called me with some surprising news. She had received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to know where Laura's body was buried. We were both skeptical, but we knew that we had to investigate the lead. Rachel arranged for us to meet with the informant, and we drove out to a remote location on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, we found a man waiting for us. He refused to give us his name, but he led us to a nearby field and pointed to a spot on the ground. He told us that Laura's body was buried there, and then he disappeared into the night. Rachel and I began to dig, and after a few minutes we uncovered a shallow grave. Inside, we found Laura's remains still wrapped in the sheet in which she had been buried. We carefully removed her body from the grave and took it to the coroner's office for examination. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains were indeed those of Laura, and we were finally able to give her a proper burial. After the burial, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, and I knew that Laura's spirit could finally rest in peace. But as we left the cemetery, I could still feel that something was watching us. It was as if Laura's ghost was still with us, thanking us for our help. After we found Laura's body and gave her a proper burial, I thought that our encounter with her ghost was over, but I was wrong. A few nights after the burial, I was sitting in my living room trying to relax after a long day at work. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. The room grew cold and I could see my breath in the air. Then, I saw her. Laura's ghost was standing in front of me, her eyes fixed on mine. I was frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. But then, something strange happened. Laura's ghost began to speak to me, not in words, but in images and feelings. I saw flashes of her life, her hopes and dreams, and the terrible pain she had endured. As I watched, I began to understand the full extent of what had happened to Laura. She had been an innocent victim, caught up in a terrible crime that had ended her life far too soon. But now, she was at peace. She had found closure, and she wanted me to know that everything was going to be all right. As her ghost began to fade away, I felt a sense of peace and closure wash over me. I knew that I had played a small part in helping Laura find the peace that she deserved. Even now, years later, I still think about that night and the strange, haunting encounter with Laura's ghost. It was a moment that changed my life forever, and one that I will never forget. As I reflect on the events of that fateful case, I can't help but think about the impact that it had on my life. The encounter with Laura's ghost taught me a lot about the power of the human spirit and the importance of fighting for justice and closure, no matter how difficult the task may seem. It also made me realize that sometimes the answers we seek are not always easy to find. We must be willing to look deeper, to dig beneath the surface, and to follow our instincts no matter where they may lead. Finally, it taught me the importance of empathy and compassion, even in the darkest of situations. As police officers, we are often called upon to deal with the most horrific crimes and the most broken of individuals. But it is our ability to show empathy and understanding that can make all the difference in the world. As I sit here, thinking about that case and the strange encounter with Laura's ghost, I realize that it has become a part of who I am. It is a reminder of the power of the human spirit and of our ability to overcome even the most difficult of challenges. And so I will carry that experience with me for the rest of my life as a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit and as a reminder of the importance of never giving up hope